And hello and welcome, everybody. My name is Ryan Belmore. I am the owner of What's Up Noop. It is 3 p.m. here on a Monday afternoon, and joining me for this conversation, to lead this conversation, is What's Up Noop's news editor, Mr. Frank Prosnitz. How are you, Frank?
I'm fine, Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing all right. And we are going to have a discussion today about the Rhode Island Solidarity Fund. And joining us first here is Christopher, and Christopher is from this is a full business card length title, Director of Organizing, Development, and Communications at Direct Action for Rights and Equality, DARE. And good afternoon there, Christopher. How are you?
I'm well. Yeah, my co-director, Kia, who's technically managing director, usually just uses co-director. So,
okay, all right. That is
you spelled it out. I really have to, I have to express my gratitude for all that.
Well, I'm impressed that you used virtually every letter of the alphabet on your card.
I hope that helps in the development world. Yeah,
of course.
And we're going to have Vanessa join us here in a couple minutes, I'm sure. But why don't we start out with telling us about your organization before we get to the Rhode Island Solidarity Fund?
Sure. Yeah. So for folks that aren't familiar, Direct Action for Rights and Equality is a membership-based social justice organization in Providence's South Side that began organizing in 1986. So it's about a year older than me. And since over the course of those 34 years, has had different advocacy campaigns around police accountability, around home daycare providers who were paid and given benefits by the state, has worked with folks that are leaving incarceration at the ACI, and has had for the last decade a housing campaign under the Tenant and Homeowner Association, which I was the organizer for before transitioning into this new long titled role in December. So in that role, we worked to prevent foreclosures and evictions related to them, and changed a law in 2014 at the state level that prevented banks from evicting tenants without fault after a foreclosure happened across the state. So hopefully preventing thousands of foreclosures and evictions over the course of that time.
Christopher, just real quickly, what was it that prompted the actual formation of the group?
So DARE was founded by 4 or 5 women living in the South Side in 1986, just as an informal response to sort of neighborhood decay and disinvestment by the city. So their initial campaign or advocacy was around a local park. So they went out and talked to their neighbors. We still use door knocking and that sort of direct outreach as a way to bring folks in. And they demanded and won the city to put resources and clean up that local area, which kind of then built on itself in the vein of welfare rights organizing in the late 80s and 90s, right into a nonprofit organization, and then into a set of principles and guiding, projects, but is always and still is led by low-income families and communities of color across the city.
So you've been hit with 2 major issues this year, the coronavirus, and of course, Black Lives Matter, which I try to keep correcting people, is not a new movement. Mm-hmm. It's been a movement for a long time. It's just that now we have had a lot more exposure in terms that what are the challenges you guys face? What are the opportunities that you have?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, in this moment, I try to look at it as an opportunity as more people see this as a place they want to step into, a movement they want to step into in different ways, an issue that they see affecting their lives. So I do think it's a growth and development opportunity, right? To get in more people's ears, to get across more people's eyeballs, right? In marketing language, and to just bring more people into the conversation. So DARE's been doing this for 34 years, but DARE is probably, for most folks in Rhode Island, still the drug prevention program that the police run in elementary schools, right? So right. I correct people all the time, even in our immediate neighborhood in South Providence, right? So we do have like a marketing struggle all the time to try and get across to folks. And I do think the biggest thing for us is that, Black Lives Matter was begun by 3 Black women, queer women, in Southern California, the hashtag and the movement, Patrisse Cullors and others. So I think it's an opportunity for us to lift up the leadership of those folks whose leadership is usually overshadowed or overlooked, right? Something DARE has been doing for a long time and has always been led by women of color, particularly Black women, and still are through Kia's leadership now. Sorry, I'm doing this interview at home, so yeah.
It's okay.
That's the boss, right?
Home means a lot of things for different folks. So yeah, I think it's that opportunity to lift up those folks' leadership and those folks' direction for, ideally this country and this world, but particularly for Providence, for Rhode Island, to hear folks' ideas and direction for a new way of doing things, and to really hear people's experiences. I think at DARE, I hear experiences that obviously I wouldn't have, as a white man, that I don't think many people really hear and feel, because they don't experience them directly, and they're not even connected to people that do. So I think I see part of my role in communications, right, in development, is to connect folks who may be outside of that experience for a lot of different reasons to the folks that have those experiences, and to really build sincere and genuine relationships with them so they feel invested in that movement. Whether they're investing dollars, right, through the Solidarity Fund or elsewise, they also feel invested personally because they get it, right, and they know people who live it.
And I'll try to give you a break here, Christopher, for a minute. We're here to talk about the Rhode Island Solidarity Fund, and it's risolidarity.fund.org, and I'll put that website on the bottom here in just a minute. But, it's a grassroots relief effort. Tell me about how you and the 6 organizations came together for this.
Sorry, relocating. Maybe the background noise will settle down.
This is what they really call a moving picture.
Yeah, well, this is grassroots nonprofit work, right? I'm sure you all know. So DARE and the Providence Youth Student Movement, AMOR.
I hope, and we'll be. I think your computer's just catching up with your move there, Christopher, and we'll wait for you to rejoin here in just a minute. There we go. Now you're connected.
I'll have to relocate again.
It's okay.
This is great. I love this. We get to know all parts of your house.
I know. You can see all the different colors we've painted it.
Yes.
So we've had longstanding relationships with many of these folks. AMOR is a coalition that includes DARE and that we helped found in large responses to the immigration and state violence crackdown that accompanied the Trump administration. And then PrYSM is an organization that was born out of DARE. So its co-founders, Sarath and Kohei, were DARE members for a period of time and recognized the need in their community, particularly Southeast Asian refugee community that established itself in Providence and Rhode Island, was dealing with a lot of internal and state-sanctioned violence and interpersonal violence. And they didn't see social services or any government intervention in their community. So they started their own organization, and PrYSM has been around for the last 17 years doing that. And then ARISE is a new organization that's also focused in the Southeast Asian community, but focused on education, which is a longstanding issue in Rhode Island for low-income families and particularly kids of color, but now has many different movement organizations like Providence Student Union and ARISE working with youth leadership to reform that system, right, which needs some serious overhaul. And FANG has been responding to environmental justice issues in Rhode Island for some time now, using really creative direct action tactics, right? Has been fighting against the Burrillville pipeline or power plant that was proposed for the state, and has actually been pretty successful in that sort of work, and has also been in the immigration work and some of the other stuff in Bristol County and Mass.
What do you see?
Go ahead, Frank. Do your organizations, the 6 organizations, usually work together? Why was it so important that the 6 of you came together to do this one fund?
Yeah, so I think, to be fair to the folks in Mass, we took leadership from them. They have a Mass Solidarity Fund. I think they call it the Redistribution Fund, right? So it comes out of 2 ideas. One, there were folks who were going to be receiving a check from the government, right, a couple months ago, or some folks still waiting on it. They were going to get a stimulus. Many of whom in this moment felt like that wasn't something they needed to keep in their pockets. It was something they wanted to contribute to this growing movement against racism, this growing movement for equity and justice. And so the folks in Mass were seizing on that opportunity, coming together as a group to get as much breadth, right, as possible across the state, and to get as much in as possible. As individual organizations, we have a certain name recognition, we have a certain niche. I think when we join together and say, not only is DARE doing work with folks who are formerly incarcerated to find reentry opportunities and change and eliminate barriers for them, ARISE and PrYSM are in the Southeast Asian community working on education. So it's an opportunity to catch people in their different facets of life and their different interests, their different connections to the work, and to demonstrate to folks that the work is really multifaceted, right? That it is multidimensional. It crosses people's identities and experiences, even though it is broadly, anti-poverty and anti-state violence work. So we saw that as an opportunity, and I think we've seen that play out We've gotten over $50,000 in donations from folks who I think are really looking for places to put their resources when they have them to support this movement, especially newer folks.
Some common issues that go across all of the organizations that are involved. Clearly, housing is a huge issue. A livable wage is a huge issue. Healthcare, food, all of those issues that we hear about, which are really at the basis of everything that has to change.
Yeah, and I think that I think that this is, again, another new opportunity to take sort of aspects of things out of silos, right? I think when you're experiencing an issue of police brutality or state violence or a deportation order, or you're not comfortable because you're, an undocumented resident, it affects your ability to have secure and sustainable and safe, healthy housing, right? So the folks that will come through DARE are coming from these different experiences in life, but we're lifting up the concept of having healthy and affordable and sustainable housing. We're not always lifting up the fact that, these things are interconnected. And part of the reason people struggle to find these things is because they have a criminal record, or because they're an undocumented refugee, or they have these other struggles in their life. So I think there's that opportunity too, to demonstrate that to folks that may not, again, live the experience or be interested to learn more about it.
And to save you from, hold on one second, Frank, because we're going to have somebody here to help Christopher answer some of the questions. And Vanessa is here to join us.
Awesome. Great.
Good afternoon, Vanessa.
Hi, everyone. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. For some reason, my phone kept blocking everything. It was very bizarre. But
it's okay.
Hi, everyone.
Hello and welcome. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your organization and how you got involved here with the fund?
Sure. I caught like a little bit of what Chris was saying. But yeah, my name is Vanessa. I am the co-executive director of the Providence Youth Student Movement, which, DARE is our parent organization. Really, DARE has been such an amazing partner to have, parent organization to have, because it really has helped us develop our lens on what it means to be a Southeast Asian or youth organization specifically, and to be working with communities of color, especially Black communities, low-income communities, and how to make sure that the work that we're doing is very intersectional. So really big shout out to DARE for all of the work that they've done to help, especially PrYSM, shape the way that we approach the work. So we're a Southeast Asian youth organization founded in 2001. So we're so close to celebrating 20 years, which is very emotional. But we do a lot of work when it comes to abolishing the school to prison to deportation pipeline. So we work with amazing youth, amazing community members on really trying to redefine what it means to have safer communities.
Excellent. And Frank, you had a question, so go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to go back real quickly to Vanessa. How and why did your organization begin?
So PrYSM began back in 2001 because we saw a rise of interpersonal, street, and state violence happening within our communities. And so I wasn't there for the founding of PrYSM. But, I've had constant conversations around why PrYSM was founded. And the main part was really addressing how Southeast Asian refugees had been really, for lack of a better term, screwed over and over again by the U.S. government. PrYSM's founding is based on the Vietnam War. So acknowledging that history of the displacement of Southeast Asian people who it only happened because of the United States intervening in these Southeast Asian countries and creating such instability within them that people were forced to come to the United States and were then placed in communities that already had limited resources, already had over-policing and a housing crisis and employment crisis and things like that. So, the reason why PrYSM came together was we need to talk about the way that Southeast Asian refugees are again and again and again being policed, being harmed, being denied resources that they need. And I'm not, so just as a full disclaimer, I'm not Southeast Asian. My family's actually from Guatemala. But there's a lot of shared history between Southeast Asia and Central America, and so for me, it was just a very natural fit to be a part of this work. But it was about the way in which the United States had created so much instability in this region and created this deportation crisis that we're seeing. And so PrYSM was born out of this need to really address the way that state violence has completely altered our lives.
How does your organization and how does DARE fit into the Black Lives Movement?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Let me try it again. How do your organizations fit into and get involved with the Black Lives Matter movement? Either one or both together.
I can go first.
Simultaneously. Go ahead, Vanessa.
PrYSM was started as a Southeast Asian organization, and we will continue to be rooted in Southeast Asian values, but we also understand that the liberation of all of our people, whether we're queer and trans, whether we're low income, whether we're Central American or Southeast Asian, is tied to the liberation of Black folks. And so that for us is very crucial in shaping our work, is understanding that we're all in struggle together. We're all aiming for liberation together. And we need to make sure that we understand and address the anti-Blackness that happens in all of our communities, right? Including in Southeast Asian, Central American communities. We need to understand that, this work isn't just affecting one person with one identity. This work is very intersectional. The same folks who are being affected by COVID are also being affected by over-policing, are also being affected by housing and by lack of education and by lack of employment opportunities. And so for us, PrYSM has been saying Black Lives Matter for years now. And while we are not a Black-led organization, we understand Black Lives Matter, and not just Black men, but especially Black women, queer and trans Black youth, low income, refugees, undocumented, really understanding that our identities are complex. And it's because of that we're affected by the same issues over and over again, because we're, we're almost fed a lie that issues that affect Black people don't affect queer and trans youth, don't affect women, don't affect refugees, but that's not true. So really understanding that the issues here are very intersectional and are very much, one is tied to the other. Just because we're talking about schools, that doesn't mean that we're not talking about policing. So that would be my response.
Now, Chris, I'm going to throw this one at you, because the Rhode Island Solidarity Fund brought together 6 community-led relief efforts to offer a one-stop option for community members and foundations to contribute directly to frontline relief during the coronavirus crisis. What is some of that frontline relief that the organizations in this fund is providing?
Yeah, so since mid-March, late March, DARE's office in South Providence has kind of been turned into a central hub for donations and supplies. So that includes food, that includes cleaning supplies, and a host of volunteers have come together to really sanitize those things, make them safe, and get them out into the community for folks that are shut in on a regular basis, but for folks that now have the added threat of not being able to take the bus or get out safely due to the virus pandemic, right? For folks that have lost income, low-income families and communities of color, particularly Black women and other folks, are often working on the front lines in fields that either have forced them out of work or they're working in very precarious situations. So we wanted to be sure, as always when we do our work, that our folks' immediate needs have been met. And as these immediate needs were so heightened at this time of the virus threat, we needed to address those things. So while we work from home and work safely, we still try to provide that to folks. I think the other organizations on the team, AMOR, the Alliance to Mobilize Our Resistance, has been doing that frontline work with immigrant communities, particularly folks facing deportation, right, and having an undocumented status, which is another layer of fear and anxiety and threat when they're just acting in their normal day-to-day lives. So with the virus on top of that, folks just don't have access to basic necessities, right? And even more limited than it used to be. So AMOR really stepped up to connect to those communities that mainstream social service agencies don't have the cultural, linguistic, or other competencies to reach, right? Or aren't really reaching deeply into those communities. So AMOR, PrYSM, DARE all had and ARISE all have these unique connections to these communities, and people will come to us looking for that help, right? Looking for that support, whether it's just listening or whether it's actual practical, tangible things that they need, because they know that that's really our MO, and that's been our prerogative since the beginning. So there's that deep, trusting relationship, and I felt, we really had that obligation to the community. So in addition, DARE's putting together an eviction defense fund. So we've been giving out direct financial assistance for housing costs with the money we've raised, and some foundation funds we've been able to garner to help folks pay the rent, to help folks pay their utility bills. And also when folks go into eviction court, potentially next month, we're hoping to have a fund that people can draw on to pay back rent and avoid, being put out in the street. I know PrYSM and ARISE have been helping individual families with costs and needs that they have, particularly legal fees around deportation cases, right? So imagine you're in a situation where you can't access basic needs or necessities, but you also have a legal case that's proceeding to deport you and send you back to a country you may have never seen. So being able to have someone pay an attorney, a good attorney, a trustworthy one, to, adjudicate your case and actually get you some modicum of justice is super important, right? Something DARE has supported, but again, doesn't have the capacity to do directly. So I think partnering with folks just made a lot of sense, because none of us could supply all these needs on our own, but together, I think we do cover a really broad spectrum of stuff folks are in need of right now.
Are there other organizations that you reach out to join with you who are not necessarily part of this coalition, but are important, particularly in terms of immigrant issues, in terms of housing issues? What are those organizations?
Vanessa, do you want to take the immigration stuff?
Yeah, I can take this one. So we actually had we really wanted Sister Fire, which is a group that aims to really address gender violence and reproductive justice within women of color specifically. And so amazing group that just started like a couple of years ago. I don't remember when, but they've been doing a lot of work to really address specifically issues that harm women of color, right? Because as a woman of color, there are a lot of issues that there's a lot of responsibility that it's assumed that I'll take on because I'm a woman. And so Sister Fire has done some amazing work really in trying to address maternal health issues, in trying to address, what does it mean to be a woman of color and be expected to do everything under the sun, and be a leader within communities. And, Sister Fire had provided mutual aid support in ways that, PrYSM definitely couldn't do because we were at capacity. And so we had really wanted to uplift their work because it was something that PrYSM was definitely benefiting from. And so, but unfortunately they were like, this is just, we don't have the capacity to do this, which is very fair. But yeah, so just definitely uplifting Sister Fire for their work, for really providing a very much needed gender lens when it comes to not just like defunding the police, not just Black Lives Matter, but also responding to COVID, right? Because a lot of...
Well, she'll come back in a minute.
I thought that was a neat trick to get caught in midstream, right? Like that.
Yeah.
But she did, Christopher, she raised a point that I wanted to ask before, and that was to define for me what we mean by defunding the police.
Ooh, well, with acknowledging that Vanessa's closer to that work, and when she comes on, she should give her answer. I do think taking leadership from the folks that, are directly impacted, since I just do the development and the facilitation work here, and don't experience police violence and brutality. Folks are really looking to dismantle a system that historically has been designed to keep Black folks, people of color, in a certain segment of society, right? I think that this is an opportunity to invert the paradigm that people believe police are really the answer to social ills, right? That police will resolve domestic violence disputes, that police will resolve issues of homelessness and poverty. And I think the truth and the proof, the statistics, the reality is there that the policing is not the response that's appropriate for these issues, right? That the question has to be put out there: why would folks call the police, and what is the real solution to the problem you're trying to address, right? And I think what I'm hearing from folks who experience this is that rarely, if ever, have they had encounters with the police, our DARE membership, that aren't violent or harmful in some way, that actually do resolve the issue at hand, right? So when folks are homeless or have a substance abuse issue, are men with guns who have poor training around, what folks are going through, who don't live the experiences of these folks and may actually be prejudiced against them in many ways, is that the immediate response we want to have? Or is the immediate response, these folks need to have their basic needs met? These folks have a medical condition that needs to be met by medical professionals, right? So I think the conversation that needs to be had is, where could those funds, and their significant funds in the city of Providence or the state of Rhode Island or elsewhere, be directed to really resolve the root causes of those problems? At DARE, we're always trying to address the root of something, as opposed to sometimes the superficial layer of symptomatic things we experience, right? Why are people homeless? Why are folks experiencing poverty? Or why did they turn to substance abuse or become part of this cycle in the first place?
So I guess
Now,
one of the things that one of the things that I think has made this a difficult issue with some people is the word defund, because they read this as meaning to, in fact, literally defund the police and therefore eliminate the police department. I see it as an issue that says, let the police do their policing, and let people who have those skills in those other areas that police don't have skills in be able to deal with all those things that you mentioned, from homelessness to housing to go right through the whole list. That you bring in people who are able to deal with those situations, either going with police or whatever, but certainly diffusing a situation in a much better way and finding a more permanent solution.
Yeah, I think that folks are stressing the permanent solution. I think the folks that I work with would also question, the police's role and how that is defined, and what role they do fill, what position they have. I work with plenty of folks, and myself and family included, that question the necessity of police in the first place, right? And I think the historic institution does need to be questioned. The reality of how they were funded and founded, and why, and what role they play. And whether that role is necessary for the society that we want, right? I think
that police were initially developed to catch runaway slaves.
Absolutely.
So I mean that was their founding.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a role for someone or some organization to be able to do some of the policing that's in the community. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to address some of the issues that they need to address.
Yeah, and I think PrYSM and Vanessa and folks are better positioned to address this, but there has been a lot of work done to figure out ways and systems and forms of organization that address some of those issues that may involve violence, that may involve interpersonal violence, right, in ways that don't require the police as they are, right, the institution as it is. And I think folks across the country, folks here in Providence, have done really amazing work on that. That's not my expertise, but I do know that's the direction we're pushing for and heading
now,
in.
Chris, this fund was started because of coronavirus and for coronavirus, and it's risolidaritykfund.org. And do you see an expiration date on this fund, or do you see this fund changing to include other topics?
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully, when the day we see the end of coronavirus.
Yeah, I mean, I think the science is out on the end of coronavirus, right? Hopefully there'll be a vaccine. It'll become part of our lexicon, just like the flu and many other things did. Unfortunately, it's a new reality, I imagine. But I think that as a development person, my mind is always geared towards how to build a relationship with the folks that want to invest in this work. I mean, I think DARE's long history is one tiny element of proof that this work is ongoing. This work is day to day over multiple decades, and we're still not at the place DARE envisions to be, right? And envisioned to be in 1986, we're still fighting some of the same battles. So I think as I try to follow up with folks who donate to the Solidarity Fund, try to introduce them to the work, try to talk to them about how investing in this work and its people, its leaders, DARE members, folks at PrYSM, folks at Arise, will really change society for the better in the long term? How do they become sustainers of this work rather than one-time donors? Because like you say, COVID as a global pandemic and issue will fade, right? Another global pandemic or issue will arise. And I think what we're always trying to do is be in it persistently and consistently, win advocacy campaigns for laws that our members want to see happen, and really win fundamental change. And I think folks that are new to this movement may not have been exposed to that. I think there was particularly in the US, a dip in that work after the welfare rights movement, and DARE kind of held on through the 90s. But I think that comes in waves. We're at a very high crest of the wave right now. And I think I'm hoping to seize that opportunity to bring people into the fold for the long term. When this becomes less exciting, when this becomes less present in people's lives, when they actually have to go back to work and the economy restarts. And, we're told by certain voices that the crisis is over, and life can resume as normal. I think folks have taken the opportunity to point out that normal was never not a crisis for many, many people, right? And that normal isn't what we want to go back to. And I think that's going to continue to take resources, right? That the state should invest and that individuals can invest. So yeah, I think that the fund, and I think even the COVID response, doing the foreclosure work I did, when folks deemed the foreclosure crisis to be over, there were hundreds of tenant families that couldn't find places to live. There were hundreds of former homeowners that had lost all of their wealth, all of their credit, all of their ability to function in the economy. And the sort of like, if I'm using the wave analogy again, the sort of like backsliding and wave in the current of things that pulls everything back into the ocean becomes ignored. So I think things like the Eviction Defense Fund, the deportation cases, those things will continue as fallout from the COVID crisis for potentially years to come. So I think there's always an opportunity to continue.
To put this in perspective a little bit, do you have any numbers to go along with it? Eventually, we're going to be facing these potential evictions. How many people are we talking about?
So the numbers are sparse. The Center for Justice that does this work as a nonprofit legal service entity for the last few years estimates that around 8,000 eviction cases get filed every year. And about 80% of those are for non-payment of rent. So the general calculation we try to make is, say, if there's a regular year that didn't involve a global pandemic where unemployment was at 4% as opposed to 17%, how many more folks do you imagine have filed for unemployment and can't make their rent and will be facing those eviction cases? So I think this is multiple of hundreds, if not thousands. And we're hoping to really encapsulate that, to tell that story, to have folks tell their story, because I think generally that goes under the radar, right? I think we've been advocating the governor invest more funds in rental assistance because the millions, admittedly millions, 6.5 million or so that she's invested already barely scratched the surface of the problem. I think if we're going to be serious about keeping people housed, we have to invest in the range of upwards of $100 million to cover people's back rent. I just don't think that the math works out any other way. And I'm hoping that hundreds of those families don't get uncounted, right? I think some of the statistical calculations are going to happen after the fact, sadly. I don't have a great hard number of how many people will go through eviction court once it sort of reopens and how that's going to work.
Yeah, that's
obviously the number one thing you want, you and your partners here want, is for people to go to your website and make a pledge. But many of the people that are watching and listening, may not have the money to give. Mm-hmm. What are some other ways that people can support Rhode Island Solidarity Fund, your organizations, but as well as those that need help?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of value that people often overlook in communicating with their neighbors, friends, families. If we're talking about Newport, DARE doesn't have an outreach team that's canvassing the north end of Newport, for instance, right? That are canvassing places where people may need free legal counsel, may be facing an eviction, may have housing conditions issues. But we don't have those informal word of mouth, familial kind of connections because we're in South Providence. So I think there's a lot of value in talking about our work. I think there's a lot of value in sharing it on social media. Our websites, our social media links are on the website, right, for our organizations if you just want to peruse them and look through them. Sharing the type of information, stories, and articles that we post there to social media that otherwise don't see a lot of mainstream coverage. Sharing that to your networks, sharing that to the folks having that conversation, even when you can't contribute by writing a check or pledging to commit to the fund. I think spreading knowledge that we're out there, that we're doing this work, and that we do want people to plug in and share that information. I'm an old school organizer, so social media is difficult for me. And I think that individuals that are cultivated and tell their stories at the State House is more valuable than posts. But our followers have increased by the hundreds, right? People that are following our Instagram or our Twitter or our Facebook page. And I think that just adds to the conversation. So when those folks are outside of DARE completely, but talking to their state senator or legislator, they may be thinking, hey, I want you to vote for that, for hunt money in the budget for a housing bond, or I want you to vote for there to be a stream of funds to build affordable housing in the state because we don't have enough, because they're reading DARE's Facebook page and they're seeing the articles and they're hearing stories of people and they're connected, right? I think when we're disconnected, it's very difficult for us to be strong advocates. We don't experience those things. We don't know they're happening nearby. But as we read and as we follow, we try to provide at DARE, and I know the other organizations, really good outlets and openings, particularly through individual people's stories, into these conversations for folks that may be outside of them.
Are there, I guess, two questions totally unrelated. One about actual volunteer opportunities for people who can get their hands dirty and work with the organization, and two, your connection with legislative initiatives.
Yeah, so DARE, different organizations in the Solidarity Fund have different relationships to, I guess, both volunteers and legislative initiatives. It's easier for me to tackle the legislative one first. So DARE has always, basically a bread and butter element of our work has been legislative advocacy campaigns, right? Whether it's changing probation rules around people that are released from the ACI, or whether it's changing the laws around who can be evicted and why. We're always at the State House advocating for statewide legislation that impacts our members. So we have strong relationships with legislators there who believe in our politics. We have a strong track record of making those changes and establishing new policy across the state that actually has often been nation leading over the last 30 years. So there's a lot of examples of that. Some on our website. Right now, we're pushing at the city level on rent control initiatives in Providence that I think will become a statewide campaign kind of inevitably because of the way the state and cities interact legally. And also trying to change licensing practices for professional licenses. So that runs from plumbers to CDL licenses to, X-ray technicians, right? Anything the state licenses often have obstacles and barriers for folks that have criminal records, even when that criminal record has nothing to do with the occupation, right? And may have been 20 or 30 years in the past. So we're trying to change state law to eliminate barriers in those licensing practices for folks that have criminal records that are trying to find stable careers. So those are two things we're working on. Other organizations do different advocacy stuff. Right now, volunteers are definitely needed to help sort donation items at DARE, to help distribute them. We've been dropping packages to people's doors. So for those that have access to a car, feel comfortable getting out there with a mask, and are at low risk for the virus and are comfortable with safety protocols, we can always use folks to plug into that. Feel free to share my email contact information. If folks are interested, they can contact me. We can talk a little bit more about orientation, how that works. As things loosen up and there's less restriction, one of DARE's biggest volunteer opportunities is door-to-door canvassing, right? So the way that I came into the organization as a volunteer was going door-to-door in Providence to houses headed foreclosure sales and explaining to the folks living there what support was out there and how to prevent the foreclosure. And a lot of times folks didn't even know. So we plug volunteers into that work, getting out there, talking to people in the neighborhood, telling them about DARE, really building a relationship with them. I came to know these folks. A lot of volunteers come to meetings, meet these folks, and see them through their process of preventing an eviction or foreclosure or staying in their home and building their leadership in the organization. So it's a great opportunity, I think, personally, to see those things, to get outside of your experience, which is something people are often looking for, especially in this time, and also to do really important work.
Excellent. And one more time, it's risolidarity.fund.org. And people can go on there and they can support and find out more about your organizations, as well as see the groups that are included in this group. Christopher, is there anything that we missed today?
Oh, well, on and on, all sorts of things, I'm sure, but nothing that's, prescient at the moment. I would say the best thing I can do is encourage folks to check out risolidarity.fund.org and even just look through the organizations, because I imagine there's at least 3 there that you hadn't heard of that you ought to learn more about, and just learn about the amazing work that they're doing, even if you don't feel you can give, even if you don't feel you can volunteer. Like I said before, I think the knowledge of and being able to follow the conversations and experience these organizations is really valuable.
And Frank, did you have anything left there?
No further questions, except just an observation that These are a bunch of grassroots organizations that have been out there, some for years and some newer. But Chris, you're so correct in that a lot of people have never heard of these groups, and important that they do and they follow their work. Different work for each one, but all with maybe some similar issues, but issues that are really just grassroots. You can get your hands knee deep in fundraising, knee deep in volunteerism, and knee deep in knowledge. So keep up the good work.
And speaking of knowledge, my good friend Allison Novick at MLK Center here in Newport pointed it out. Sometimes the people that need the resources of these organizations aren't what you think they look like. And sometimes it could be the person bagging your groceries. It could be a bank teller. It could be your neighbor. And having this type of information, even in the back of your head, and being able to say, hey, you need help. Here's a great resource. You pointed it out earlier, Christopher, about communication. And, if we open up the conversation more between everybody, we're going to find out more and more that people that need help and hopefully be able to share resources.
You find, I just wanted to throw, I talk with a lot of people who are involved with homeless, and many of those people are out working. I remember in Providence, before they did the relocated Route 195, under the bridge, there used to be a tent city. And when you ride by that tent city during the day, it was vacant. You'd see a tricycle here or there. Those kids were in school. Parents were out working, and they came at night back to this tent city. And for one reason or another, they had to make choices. They had to make choices whether they paid for housing, whether they paid for food, whether they paid for health care. These were tough choices, but these are hardworking, good people who Brian, you're absolutely correct. They're your neighbors. Many of your neighbors, many of your friends, many of the grocery clerks that you run into every day.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Christopher, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Thank you for the time and the opportunity to share our work.
Thank you,
right.
Chris.
And one more time, it is RISolidarityFund.org. Thank you, everybody. That's going to do it for us here on this edition of One-on-One Conversation. We'll be back tomorrow at 3 p.m. with Keith Stokes.